28 was not merely an age in Mayfair, it was a slow public execution. Isabella knew this because her aunt tallied every graying hair like a debt collector. She was the ghost at every ball, draped in heavy, unforgiving sage green, enduring the stifled giggles of girls 10 years her junior. They called her the Relic. They thought she was deaf to their cruelty. They never suspected that before the season ended, the Duke of Rothford would ruin them all for her. Beeswax and stale lavender water hung thick in the air of the Danbury ballroom, creating a sickly sweet miasma that settled at the back of Isabella's throat. It was her 7th season, or perhaps her 8th. She had stopped counting after the 5th, when the polite inquiries from passing gentlemen had curdled into tight, pitying smiles before they hurried past to claim dances with girls fresh from the schoolroom. She stood, as she always did, stationed near a potted fern that was browning at the edges. Her gown, a heavy, unyielding silk the color of bruised sage, felt more like upholstery than clothing. The boning of her corset dug a sharp, familiar ache into her lower ribs with every shallow breath. Beside her, Aunt Agatha was a vibrating mass of nervous energy and misplaced ambition, her fan snapping open and shut like a bird of prey snapping its beak. "Stand straight, Isabella," Agatha hissed, not looking at her niece but scanning the room with predatory intent. "You are slouching like a dock worker. Lord Hastings just glanced in this direction." "Lord Hastings is looking at the platter of roast pheasant behind us, Aunt," Isabella replied. Her voice was flat, devoid of the musical lilt expected of unmarried women. It was the voice of a woman who had long ago traded hope for mere endurance. Agatha clicked her tongue, a wet, dismissive sound. "With that attitude, it is a wonder they even let us through the doors. Look at the Cavendish girl, barely out of leading strings, yet she commands the room." Isabella didn't need to look. She could hear Harriet Cavendish from 20 paces away, a high, reedy laugh that scraped against Isabella's eardrums like sandpaper. Harriet was 17, wrapped in pale pink tulle, her cheeks flushed with the heat of the room and the intoxicating power of being desired. A cluster of young women had formed around Harriet, a tight circle of whispering silk and glittering jewels. They were close enough that Isabella could catch fragments of their conversation over the screech of the string quartet attempting a waltz. "Did you see her dress?" A girl in lemon yellow tittered, casting a sideways glance toward the fern. "It looks as though she tore down the curtains at a country inn." "I heard she is nearly 30, Harriet whispered loudly, the faux secrecy a weapon in itself. "My mother says if a woman is unwed by 25, her womb dries up entirely. She is practically a museum piece, the relic of Mayfair." A chorus of muffled giggles followed. Isabella didn't flinch. She didn't press a hand to her chest or cast her eyes downward in silent martyrdom. She just felt tired. A deep, marrow-deep exhaustion that made her want to sit on the slick parquet floor and take off her slippers. She felt a brief, ugly flare of spite, a sudden urge to tell Harriet that her pink gown made her look like an undercooked prawn. But she swallowed it down. The spite only made her feel pathetic. It tasted metallic on her tongue, like chewing on foil. The murmurs in the room suddenly shifted. The pitch of the collective chatter dropped an octave, replaced by a frantic, buzzing hum. The doors at the far end of the ballroom had opened. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Rothford, had arrived. Isabella watched him navigate the threshold. He didn't glide into the room like the heroes in the penny dreadfuls her maid smuggled into the house. He walked with a heavy, uneven gait, favoring his left leg just slightly. He was tall, but his shoulders sloped with a terrible visible weariness. His dark coat was impeccably tailored, but his cravat was tied with an almost violent impatience, lacking the intricate folds the dandies favored. He did not look dashing. He looked profoundly annoyed. As the sea of pastel dresses parted for him, Isabella noticed the rigid set of his jaw. Mothers shoved their daughters forward, their smiles stretched so wide they looked skeletal. The Duke offered curt nods, brushing past the traps laid out for him with a brutal efficiency. He smelled, even from a distance, like cold rain and something sharp. Cloves, perhaps, or cheap gin. It was an offensive scent in a room choking on floral perfumes. Isabella turned her gaze back to the browning fern. He was another world's problem. The most desired man in London did not concern the relic. Her feet throbbed in her tight satin shoes. The corset dug deeper. She reached a hand up to rub the back of her neck, feeling the bumpy, raised skin of a stress rash forming just beneath her hairline. Just 2 more hours, she told herself. 2 more hours of standing very still, pretending she could not hear the laughter, and then she could go home and wash the smell of beeswax from her skin. The headache began behind her right eye, a sharp, pulsing throb that beat in time with the horrific scraping of the cellist's bow. After another 20 minutes of Aunt Agatha's complaints about the draft, Isabella muttered an excuse about needing the retiring room and slipped away. She didn't go to the retiring room. The retiring room was full of young women reapplying rouge and comparing dance cards. Instead, she navigated the narrow, dimly lit back hallways of the Danbury estate. The floorboards here were unpolished, muffling her footsteps. She sought the small card room at the end of the east wing, a room usually abandoned during balls because it smelled faintly of stale cigars and damp wool. She pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the gloom, letting out a breath she felt she had been holding since she stepped out of her carriage. The room was dark, illuminated only by the weak moonlight filtering through a dusty window and the dying embers in the hearth. Without hesitating, Isabella walked to the closest leather armchair, sank into it, and reached down to unbuckle her right shoe. "If you are going to remove your stockings as well, I should probably announce my presence." The voice was low, rough around the edges, and came from the shadows near the fireplace. Isabella froze, her fingers still curled around the leather strap of her shoe. A surge of hot, prickling panic washed over her neck, aggravating the rash. She squinted into the dim light. A figure leaned against the mantelpiece. The Duke of Rothford. He was holding a crystal tumbler, his white-gloved thumb rubbing absent-mindedly against the rim. He had discarded his formal coat. It lay in a crumpled heap on a nearby table. His waistcoat was unbuttoned at the top. Isabella didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She slowly pulled her hand away from her shoe and sat back against the leather. Her heart was beating uncomfortably fast, not from fluttery romance, but from the raw, mortifying reality of being caught seeking relief like a tired workhorse. "I apologize, Your Grace," Isabella said, her voice dry. "I thought the room was empty." "It was," he replied, taking a slow sip from his glass, "until you marched in looking as though you were planning an assassination." "Only of my cobbler," she muttered before she could stop herself. The Duke stopped rubbing the rim of his glass. He turned his head, stepping slightly out of the shadows. His face was pale, his dark eyes shadowed by deep purple bags. He looked older than his 32 years. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in a decade. "A poorly fitted shoe is a torture device," he agreed softly. He didn't sound amused. He sounded entirely serious. "Take it off. I won't look." Isabella hesitated. Propriety dictated she flee the room immediately. Being alone with a man, let alone an unmarried duke, was grounds for social ruin. But she was 28. Ruin implied she had something left to lose. She reached down and yanked the shoe off. The sudden rush of blood to her cramped toes was agonizingly sweet. She let out a tiny, barely audible sigh. Arthur turned fully to face her, though he kept his gaze pointedly fixed on the dead embers in the grate. Hiding from the matrimonial auction?" he asked, his tone laced with a heavy, bitter cynicism. "Hiding from the noise," Isabella corrected. "I'm no longer on the auction block, Your Grace. I'm merely the unsellable inventory they leave in the window to make the newer models look more appealing." Arthur let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. He finally looked at her. He didn't rake his eyes over her form. He looked straight at her face. The dim light highlighted the sharp angles of her jaw and the dark circles under her own eyes that matched his. "You are Miss Huxley," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm surprised you know my name. We have never been introduced." know everyone's name, he said, staring into his drink. It is a defense mechanism. If you know who they are, you know exactly what they want from you. And what do I want from you, Your Grace? She asked, challenging him slightly. She crossed her stockinged foot over her ankle, hiding it beneath the heavy sage skirts. Arthur looked at her again. His gaze was heavy, searching. He looked at the stiff posture she maintained even in the armchair, the way her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, the severe, unadorned style of her hair. Quiet, he said simply. You want quiet. And perhaps for your aunt to stop prodding you in the ribs? Isabella blinked, genuinely startled. You saw that? Miss Huxley, I see everything. It is a curse. He walked over to a small side table where a decanter of amber liquid sat. He poured a small measure into a second glass and walked it over to her. He held it out. She stared at the glass. It was whiskey. Ladies did not drink whiskey. It tastes like peat and smoke, he said, noticing her hesitation. But it dulls the sensation of tight corsets and empty conversation. Isabella reached out. Her bare fingers brushed the rough cotton of his glove. He didn't pull away. She took the glass. The liquid burned her throat, leaving a trail of fire down her chest. But he was right. It felt warm and real and utterly unrefined. Why are you hiding in here? She asked, her voice slightly raspy from the liquor. You could have any woman in that ballroom. You could have 3 if you asked. I do not want 3. I do not want 1. Arthur dragged a hand down his face, the sound of his glove against his jaw rough in the quiet room. They do not want me, Miss Huxley. They want the title. They want the estate in Kent. They look at me and see a ledger, a bank account, a crown. If I died tomorrow, they would fight over my corpse for the rings on my fingers. The raw, ugly honesty in his voice caught Isabella off guard. She looked at him, really looked at him. The slight limp, the exhausted eyes, the bitter slope of his mouth. That is the nature of the market, she said quietly. You are the prize bull. I am the lame horse. We are both just meat, Your Grace. Your cage is simply gilded. Arthur stared at her. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. The sound of the waltz from the distant ballroom felt like a transmission from another planet. For a moment, Isabella thought she had gone too far. She had insulted a duke. She had called him meat. Then Arthur Pendleton smiled. It wasn't a charming smile. It was a dark, crooked thing that didn't reach his eyes, but it changed his entire face. The lame horse, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. Put your shoe back on, Miss Huxley. Isabella stiffened. Why? Because, he said, setting his empty glass down on the mantel with a sharp clink. If we stay in here much longer, someone will find us. And while I would not mind ruining your pristine reputation, I refuse to be trapped into a marriage by Agatha Huxley. The bluntness of it stung, but it was honest. Isabella bent down, wincing as she shoved her swollen foot back into the rigid leather shoe. When she stood, she was momentarily unsteady. Arthur's hand shot out, gripping her elbow. His grip was firm, grounding. Through the thick silk of her sleeve, she could feel the heat of his hand. He released her almost instantly, stepping back. Return to the ballroom, he instructed. Wait 5 minutes before I follow. Isabella nodded, suddenly feeling incredibly foolish. She had shared whiskey in the dark with a duke. She smoothed down her skirts, the heavy sage fabric rustling loudly. Without another word, she walked to the door. Miss Huxley. She paused, her hand on the brass doorknob. Your dress, Arthur said, his voice quiet in the gloom. It is terrible, but you are not. Isabella didn't look back. She pushed the door open and fled into the bright, suffocating hallway. The air in the ballroom felt 10 degrees hotter when Isabella returned. She slipped back into her spot beside the browning fern, her heart still beating a chaotic rhythm against her tight ribs. The taste of smoke and peat lingered on her tongue. Where have you been? Aunt Agatha hissed, her fingers wrapping around Isabella's wrist like a vice. You missed Lord Abernathy. He actually looked in this direction. Lord Abernathy is 82 and blind in his left eye, Aunt, Isabella said, her voice surprisingly steady. The whiskey had left a dull, pleasant buzz in her veins. He was likely looking at the candelabra. Agatha gasped, dropping her arm as if burned. You are impossible. A miserable, ungrateful burden. Do not think I will support you when... The doors opened again. The room, which had resumed its frantic buzzing in the Duke's absence, fell dead silent. Arthur strode in. He had put his coat back on, buttoned improperly. The fatigue was still etched into his face, but there was a new, hard edge to his posture. He didn't hug the walls this time. He walked directly into the center of the room. The string quartet, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, faltered, screeching to a halt before hastily starting up a sweeping, dramatic waltz. The mothers mobilized. Lady Cavendish practically shoved 17-year-old Harriet into Arthur's path. Harriet giggled, a terrible practice sound, and fluttered her fan. Your Grace, Harriet piped up, her voice carrying through the quiet room. The music is so lovely, is it not? Arthur stopped. He looked at Harriet. He looked at the pink tulle, the flushed cheeks, the desperate, hungry eyes of her mother hovering just behind her. Isabella watched from the wall, her stomach twisting. This was how it happened. The prize bull chose his pasture. Excuse me, Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a physical blade. He did not bow. He simply stepped around Harriet as if she were a piece of misplaced furniture. Harriet's jaw dropped. A collective, suppressed gasp echoed from the bystanders. Arthur kept walking. He walked past the girls in lemon yellow and sky blue. He walked past the heiresses and the earl's daughters. He walked in a straight, unwavering line, favoring his left leg, until he stopped directly in front of the Browning fern, directly in front of Isabella. Aunt Agatha made a sound like a strangled cat. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. She looked up at Arthur. Up close, under the harsh glare of the chandeliers, she could see the faint stubble on his jaw and a small white scar intersecting his left eyebrow. He didn't smile. He held out his white-gloved hand. Miss Huxley, he said, his voice carrying perfectly into the cavernous silence of the ballroom. I believe this is my dance. Isabella stared at his hand. Her chest tightened to the point of pain. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a spectacle. He was using her. He was taking the unsellable inventory onto the floor to deliver a massive, insulting blow to every ambitious mother and simpering debutante in the room. He was using her as a shield. She should refuse. It would be a scandal, but it would preserve her fragile, threadbare dignity. She looked at his face. He wasn't pleading, but there was a tightness around his eyes. Quiet. You want quiet. Isabella swallowed the metallic taste of fear. Slowly, stiffly, she placed her hand in his. The room erupted into furious, scandalized whispers. Isabella felt 100 pairs of eyes burning into her back as Arthur led her to the center of the floor. His hand moved to her waist. It was not a gentle, hovering touch. He gripped her firmly, his fingers pressing into the heavy sage silk, feeling the rigid boning of her corset beneath. You are making a mistake, she whispered furiously as he pulled her into the frame of the waltz. They will tear us apart. Let them try, he muttered. He stepped forward, forcing her backward. The dance began. It wasn't a graceful, sweeping waltz. Arthur's slight limp gave their movements a staggered, slightly off-kilter rhythm. Isabella, out of practice, and trembling with a cocktail of rage, fear, and the lingering whiskey, stumbled on the first turn. Instead of letting her falter, Arthur's grip tightened painfully on her waist, hoisting her up and pulling her closer. They were inches apart. The scent of cloves and rain was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, feel the dampness of sweat on his brow. You are using me, she hissed. keeping her face perfectly frozen in a neutral mask for the watching crowd. To punish them. I am dancing with you, he corrected, his voice a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Because you are the only woman in this room who does not want to strip the flesh from my bones. I called you meat 20 minutes ago, and yet you haven't taken a bite. He spun them, a sharp, aggressive turn that made the heavy silk of her skirts whip around her ankles. The physical exertion was real. This wasn't a polite stroll across the floor. It was a battle of gravity and tension. Isabella could hear the sound of their shoes scuffing the parquet, a harsh, rhythmic scraping beneath the polite melody of the cellos. They are laughing at us, she breathed, catching sight of Harriet Cavendish's flushed, furious face over Arthur's shoulder. They are not laughing, Arthur said, his eyes locked onto hers. The exhaustion in his face had been replaced by a fierce, burning intensity. They are bleeding out from shock. Let them bleed. Isabella's breath hitched, not from romance, but from the raw, dangerous energy radiating from the man holding her. She noticed the slight tremble in his hand where it clasped hers. He was in physical pain from the dancing, yet he refused to stop. He pushed her through the steps, an imperfect, ragged rhythm that felt more intimate than a kiss. She stopped fighting his lead. She leaned into his rigid frame, letting him support her weight as the music swelled. For the first time in 8 years, Isabella Huxley closed her eyes on the dance floor, oblivious to the horrified whispers, anchored only by the heavy, bruising grip of the Duke of Rothford. Rain lashed against the streaked window panes of the Huxley dining room, dragging gray morning light across the scarred mahogany table. The euphoria of the waltz had not survived the carriage ride home. In the harsh, unforgiving light of day, Isabella's bones ached with the memory of the Duke's punishing grip, and her mouth tasted of stale chamomile and regret. Aunt Agatha sat at the opposite end of the table, methodically shredding a piece of cold toast into unrecognizable crumbs. She had not slept. Her hair, usually pinned into a severe, immovable architecture, frizzed at the temples. "You have ruined us," Agatha stated. Her voice lacked its usual screech. It was dangerously quiet, hollowed out by genuine despair. A spectacle, a complete, unmitigated spectacle. Lady Jersey looked right at me as we left and visibly shuddered. Shuddered, Isabella. Isabella kept her eyes on the chipped rim of her teacup. The tea was tepid, filming over with a thin, oily skin. "He asked me to dance, Aunt. It would have been a greater scandal to refuse a duke. Do not play the fool." Agatha slammed her palm against the table. The teacups rattled, a sharp ceramic clatter. "He used you as a prop, a stick to beat those ambitious mothers with. And you let him. You allowed yourself to be hoisted up like a warning flag. By tomorrow, every drawing room in London will be laughing at the relic who thought the Duke of Rothford actually fancied her." The truth of it settled heavy and cold in Isabella's stomach, a stone swallowed whole. She knew Agatha was right. She had known it on the dance floor. But acknowledging it aloud stripped away the tiny, pathetic sliver of pride she had hoarded during the night. "I did not think he fancied me," Isabella said, her voice tight, defensive. "I am fully aware of what I am." "Are you?" Agatha sneered, the fear morphing back into familiar cruelty. "Because for 3 minutes last night, you looked as though you believed you belonged in his arms. It was humiliating to witness." Isabella gripped the edge of the table, the wood biting into her cuticles. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hurl the cold tea across the room. Instead, she inhaled the scent of damp wool radiating from her own morning dress and stared at the gray rain. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front hall. Both women froze. At this hour, visitors were unheard of. Tradesmen used the back entrance. Callers did not arrive until after 1 o'clock, and the Huxleys received very few of those regardless. Footsteps patted down the hall. Their lone maid, a girl of 16 who smelled permanently of onions and lye soap, cracked open the dining room door. Her eyes were wide, darting nervously between Agatha and the hallway. "Ma'am," the maid squeaked. It's it's a gentleman. He handed me his card." Agatha snatched the small white rectangle from the silver tray. All color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax effigy. She stared at the card, then looked at Isabella, her mouth working silently. "Who is it?" Isabella demanded, pushing her chair back. Its wooden legs scraped harshly against the floorboards. Without a word, Agatha tossed the card onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from Isabella's cold tea. Arthur Pendleton, Duke of Rothford. A sudden dizzying rush of adrenaline spiked through Isabella's chest. He was here. He had actually come. The scent of last night's whiskey and cloves phantom drifted through her memory. "Send him into the parlor," Agatha hissed at the maid, suddenly frantic, swatting at her frizzy hair. "Light the fire, quickly! Good God, Isabella, look at your dress. It is practically a rag." "It will have to do," Isabella said, standing. Her knees felt weak, shaky. She smoothed down the front of her dark blue day dress. It was unadorned, severely cut, and missing a button near the hem. It was the dress of a governess, not a duchess in waiting. She walked down the narrow, drafty hallway. The parlor was freezing, smelling of dust and ancient potpourri. Arthur stood by the unlit hearth, dwarfing the cramped room. He wore a heavy wool riding coat, droplets of rain clinging to the broad shoulders. He looked just as exhausted as he had the night before, his jaw shadowed with dark stubble, his eyes ringed with violet fatigue. He turned as she entered. He didn't offer a charming smile or a sweeping bow. He just looked at her, taking in the severe dress, the tight bun, the defensive cross of her arms. "You did not sleep," he observed, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in the quiet room. "Neither did you, it seems," Isabella replied, refusing to shrink under his gaze. "Sleep is a luxury for those without a target on their backs." He limped slightly as he stepped away from the hearth, bringing the damp, earthy smell of the rain with him. "Get your cloak, Miss Huxley. We are going for a drive." Isabella stared at him, her brows drawing together. "A drive? In this weather?" "Your Grace, it is pouring." "The rain will keep the worst of the gawkers at bay, though not all of them, which is the point." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather driving glove, tugging it onto his hand with sharp, jerky movements. "Your aunt is currently hyperventilating in the hallway. Let us leave before she demands I state my intentions." "And what are your intentions?" Isabella asked. She didn't move toward the door. She stood her ground, feeling the draft seep through her thin soles. Arthur stopped pulling at the glove. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a startling, brutal honesty. "To be seen with you, to make it unequivocally clear that last night was not a momentary lapse in judgment, to ruin their ledgers and their plans." "You want to use me again?" "Yes." The single word hung in the air, stripped of any polite societal veneer. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't offering her empty flattery. He was offering a transaction. Isabella looked at his tense jaw, the weary slump of his shoulders beneath the heavy wool. The ton wanted to consume him. They wanted to mock her. "Let me fetch my cloak," she said. The carriage interior smelled of rich, oiled leather and wet dog. Arthur sat opposite her, his bad legs stretched out stiffly, taking up a considerable amount of the cramped space. He made no apology for it. He stared out the window at the blurred, rain-soaked streets of London, his profile hard and unyielding. Isabella sat rigidly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her cloak was an old, heavy wool garment that smelled faintly of camphor. She felt entirely inadequate against the plush velvet squabs of the ducal carriage. "Are you taking me to Hyde Park to parade me like a prize sow?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Arthur turned his head slowly. The corner of his mouth twitched, a momentary break in his grim facade. "I prefer the term unsellable inventory. And yes, we are going to the park, the carriage route. The gossips will be stationed at the gates, rain or no rain. They will say you are mad. Let them. They will say you are trying to punish Lady Cavendish by insulting her daughter with my presence. Arthur's gaze darkened. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. I do not care about Lady Cavendish. I do not care about her simpering daughter. I care about a quiet life. And you, Miss Huxley, are the quietest woman I have ever met. Isabella swallowed, the knot in her throat thickening. Because I have nothing to say to them. Because you see them for what they are, he corrected. He gestured vaguely to his outstretched leg. Do you know how I got this? Isabella looked down at the dark gray wool covering his left limb. The rumors say you were injured in the war, a hero's wound. Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely no humor. A hero's wound. God, they love their romantic fictions. No, Miss Huxley, I was drunk. I was 23, deeply intoxicated on cheap ale, and I decided to race a carriage down a flooded country lane. I overturned the rig. The horse panicked and crushed my leg. I lay in the mud for 6 hours screaming for my mother. The blunt, ugly confession hit Isabella like a physical blow. She stared at him, taking in the shame tightly woven into the tense lines of his face. He wasn't fishing for pity. He was tearing down the pedestal society had forced him onto. It healed badly, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. It aches when it rains. It aches when I stand too long. I am not a dashing war hero. I am a reckless fool who got lucky enough to inherit a title before his older brother's debts ruined the estate. He sat back against the velvet, watching her intently, waiting for the disgust, waiting for the polite retreat. Isabella looked at his leg, then back up to his exhausted eyes. She thought of her own worn dresses, the stress rash that flared on her neck, the crushing daily humiliation of Aunt Agatha's ledgers. I tripped over my own hem at my debut, Isabella said quietly, the memory a sour ache on her tongue. I tore the lace. My father had spent the last of our credit on that dress. I spent the rest of the evening hiding in a pantry behind a sack of flour, crying so hard I threw up. Arthur blinked, clearly caught off guard. We all have our mud, Your Grace, she added, turning her gaze to the rain-streaked window. Some of us just aren't permitted to wash it off. Silence descended on the carriage again, but the texture of it had changed. It was no longer a tense, vibrating wire between them. It felt strangely like a truce. The carriage slowed as they entered the gates of Hyde Park. Despite the drizzle, the carriage paths were not empty. Covered phaetons and enclosed landaus crawled along the gravel. As Rothford's carriage, bearing the unmistakable ducal crest, merged into the line, Isabella saw the movement. Faces pressed against the glass of passing carriages. Curtains were yanked aside. The collective gasp of the ton was almost audible over the rain. Sit up, Miss Huxley, Arthur commanded softly. Isabella stiffened her spine. She did not shrink back into the shadows of the carriage. She moved closer to the window, letting the gray light fall fully on her plain face, her severe hair, her camphor-scented cloak. She looked directly at a passing carriage where Lady Jersey was practically vibrating with shock. Arthur watched her. He watched the rigid set of her jaw and the defiant tilt of her chin. He reached across the small space and rested his gloved hand lightly over hers where they were tightly clasped in her lap. His hand was heavy, warm, and solid. Isabella didn't pull away. She let him anchor her as they rode through the storm of whispers, an alliance forged in cynicism and mutual distaste for the world outside the glass. 3 days later, the summons arrived. It was a heavy, cream-colored envelope, smelling cloyingly of attar of roses. Lady Cavendish requested the honor of Miss Isabella Huxley's presence at an intimate afternoon tea. It is a trap, Isabella said, staring at the invitation as if it were a coiled snake. She stood in the center of the cramped parlor, the paper trembling slightly in her fingers. Of course it is a trap, Aunt Agatha snapped, pacing the worn rug. They want to examine the anomaly. They want to humiliate you in broad daylight to prove to the Duke that you are utterly unsuitable, and you must go. Isabella looked up, her stomach twisting. Go? Why? So Harriet Cavendish can point out my wrinkles over a plate of scones? Because if you cower, you lose the ground you gained, Agatha said, her voice dropping into a deadly serious register. For once, she wasn't shrieking. She was strategizing. The Duke has called on you twice. He drove you through the park. You have their attention, Isabella. Do not let them think you are afraid of them. So, Isabella went. The Cavendish drawing room was a suffocating explosion of wealth. Gilded mirrors reflected the overly bright afternoon sun, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive hothouse blooms and the sugary sweat of too many bodies crammed into one space. As Isabella was announced, the chatter died instantly. It was the same silence that had greeted Arthur at the Danbury ball, but here it was not laced with awe. It was laced with predatory anticipation. Lady Cavendish, a woman who looked like a heavily powdered falcon, swooped in. "Miss Huxley," she cooed, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "How terribly brave of you to join us. Do come sit. We were just discussing the latest fashions from Paris. I fear they might be a bit youthful for your tastes, but one can always dream." A titter of laughter swept through the room. Isabella spotted Harriet sitting on a velvet settee, flanked by her sycophants. Harriet was wearing a gown of pale blue silk that probably cost more than the Huxleys' entire yearly income. Isabella kept her face perfectly blank. "Youthful fashion is a fleeting comfort, Lady Cavendish. I prefer garments constructed to endure." She walked past the hostess, refusing to be herded into a corner, and took a seat on a stiff-backed chair near the tea service. The fabric of her own dress, a dark plum wool, felt oppressively heavy in the overheated room. The next hour was an exercise in subtle torture. They did not attack her openly. They used the weapons of polite society: backhanded compliments, excluded conversations, and pointed pity. "It must be so restful," a girl in yellow simpered, "not having to worry about dance cards filling up. All that free time to read." "Yes," Isabella replied dryly, accepting a cup of tea she didn't want. "I find books offer far more intellectual stimulation than the average ballroom." Harriet's eyes flashed. She leaned forward, balancing a delicate porcelain saucer on her knee. "I hear the Duke of Rothford enjoys reading. Perhaps that is what you discuss when he takes you on those dreary, rainy drives, since you certainly couldn't discuss the season's prospects." "We discuss many things, Miss Cavendish," Isabella said, her grip tightening on her own teacup. The heat of the ceramic burned her fingers, grounding her. "He is likely just taking pity on you," Harriet said, dropping the veneer of politeness entirely. Her young face twisted into something ugly and petulant. "He is a duke. He has responsibilities. He needs an heir, not an aging spinster who dresses like a vicar's widow. You are a momentary distraction, Miss Huxley, a joke he is playing on the ton." The words hit their mark. The breath left Isabella's lungs. It was the exact fear that kept her awake at night, spoken aloud by a 17-year-old girl with vicious precision. The room fell utterly silent, waiting for the relic to crack, waiting for the tears. Isabella opened her mouth, though her throat was bone dry. She wouldn't cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Miss Cavendish's grasp of my responsibilities is astoundingly poor." The voice came from the doorway. Every head snapped around. Arthur Pendleton stood on the threshold. He had not been announced. He wore severe black day clothes, lacking a walking stick, though he leaned heavily against the doorframe. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. Lady Cavendish leaped up, dropping a scone onto the carpet. "Your Grace, we did not expect—" Clearly, Arthur cut her off. He did not look at the hostess. He did not look at Harriet, whose face had gone a sickening shade of white. He looked only at Isabella. He crossed the room. His limp was pronounced today, a harsh, dragging sound against the plush carpet. The sea of pastel dresses parted for him in sheer panic. He reached Isabella's chair and stopped. He didn't offer a polite bow. He reached down and took the teacup from her trembling hands, setting it on a nearby table with a loud clatter. "You are suffocating in here, Isabella," he said. He didn't use her surname. The familiarity sent a shockwave through the room. "I'm quite well, Your Grace," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "You are a terrible liar," he murmured. He held out his hand. It was the exact same gesture he had made in the ballroom, but this time it was not a challenge to the room. It was a lifeline to her. Isabella looked at his large, gloved hand. She looked at Harriet, who was staring at Arthur with wide, tear-filled eyes, finally realizing she had lost a game she didn't even understand the rules of. Isabella placed her hand in his. He pulled her up. He didn't let go. He tucked her hand securely into the crook of his arm, pressing her close against his side. "Lady Cavendish," Arthur said, finally turning his dark, dead-eyed gaze on the hostess. "Your tea is bitter, and your hospitality is abhorrent. Miss Huxley will not be accepting any further invitations to this house." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned, pulling Isabella with him, and walked her out of the room. They didn't speak until they were outside, standing on the pavement in the crisp, cold air. The sudden release of tension left Isabella feeling lightheaded. She swayed slightly. Arthur caught her shoulder, his grip firm. "Breathe," he commanded gently. She took a ragged gasp of air. "You shouldn't have done that. You have made an enemy of the Cavendish family." "I am the Duke of Rothford," Arthur said, his voice hard but his eyes entirely focused on her pale face. "The Cavendish family are gnats. Let them buzz." He reached up, his thumb brushing a stray curl away from her forehead. The touch was startlingly intimate, stripping away the harshness of the street. "Are you all right?" Isabella looked up at him. She saw the exhaustion, the pain in his leg, the brutal cynicism, but she also saw something fiercely protective. He wasn't using her anymore. They had crossed a line in that drawing room. "No," she said honestly, the armor finally cracking. "I'm tired, Arthur." He didn't flinch at her use of his Christian name. The crooked dark smile returned, warming his face. "So am I, Isabella," he said softly. "Let me take you home." Some dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through the Huxley parlor windows, settling on the worn upholstery of the chairs. Aunt Agatha had not stopped pacing for an hour. Her earlier terror had mutated into something far more dangerous, ravenous, unadulterated ambition. "He took you out of that house by the arm," Agatha muttered, chewing vigorously on her thumbnail. "In front of everyone. A public declaration, Isabella. Do you understand what this means? The Cavendish girl is ruined, and you hold the winning ticket." Isabella sat on the sofa, her knees pulled tight together, staring at the frayed hem of her plum dress. Her stomach churned, producing a sour, acidic burn in her throat. She did not feel like she held a winning ticket. She felt like a fox who had survived the hunt, only to realize she was now locked in a cage with the hounds. He was angry, Aunt. He acted on impulse to punish them. "Dukes do not act on impulse," Agatha snapped, rounding on her. "They act on entitlement, and he has entitled himself to you. We must order new dresses, immediately. I will go to Madame Rousseau. We will sell the silver service if we must. You cannot receive him again looking like a displaced scullery maid." Before Isabella could protest the utter madness of selling their last valuable possession for a gamble, the heavy thud of the brass knocker echoed through the narrow hall. It was not the 16-year-old maid who opened the parlor door, but Arthur himself. He had bypassed the servant entirely, an act of shocking familiarity. He had discarded his heavy coat, standing in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, the fine white linen wrinkled at the elbows. He looked stripped down, raw. Agatha gasped, her hands fluttering to her throat. Your Grace, we we were just preparing for tea. Leave us, Arthur said. He did not look at Agatha. His gaze was fixed on Isabella, heavy and dark. I It is highly improper for me to leave you unchaperoned, Your Grace, Agatha stammered, though she was already taking a step backward toward the door. Leave us, he repeated, the gravel in his voice hardening into stone. Agatha fled. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound loud like a pistol shot in the small room. Arthur crossed the space in 3 long, uneven strides. He bypassed the armchairs entirely and sank down onto the sofa beside Isabella. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He smelled of rain, sharp cloves, and a deep permeating weariness. He dropped his head back against the worn floral fabric and closed his eyes. Tell me, he murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion, that you do not want my money. Isabella stiffened, her hands clenched in her lap. I have no use for a fortune I could never hope to spend. Tell me you do not care about the title. The title is a target, she replied softly. I have enough bruises from simply being myself. Arthur opened his eyes. He turned his head on the cushion to look at her. The violet shadows under his eyes looked darker today, the lines around his mouth carved deeper. My brother left me in a state rotting from the inside, he said, the words slipping out in a quiet, steady stream. The ledgers are a nightmare. The roof at the Kent Manor leaks. I have 70 tenants who rely on me to not gamble away their livelihoods like my predecessor did. The Tun looks at me and sees a crown. I look at it and see a millstone. Isabella listened. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She looked at his left leg, stretched out awkwardly in front of him, the fine trousers doing nothing to hide the rigid stiffness of the limb. Why are you telling me this, Arthur? Because you are the only person who hasn't asked me for a favor since my brother died, he said. He reached out, his bare hand covering hers. His palm was hot, slightly calloused, pressing down on her cold fingers. They want the fantasy. You are the only woman I know who lives purely in the mud. Isabella's breath caught. It was not a compliment in the traditional sense. It was a harsh, unvarnished truth. I cannot offer you romance, Isabella, he continued, his thumb tracing the prominent knuckles of her hand. I am too tired for courtship. I have no patience for poetry. I have a bad leg, a terrible temper, and a profound hatred for the society we live in. He sat up slightly, shifting his weight, grimacing as his knee popped in the quiet room. But I can offer you quiet, he said, looking squarely into her eyes. I can offer you a library in Kent with 10,000 books and a door that locks from the inside. I can offer you safety from Agatha's ledgers. I can make sure no one in this God-forsaken city ever looks at you with pity again. It was a business proposal. It was a transaction. But as Arthur looked at her, his dark eyes wide and vulnerable, Isabella felt a sharp, painful ache in her chest. He was begging her. The most desired man in London was begging the relic of Mayfair to save him from his own life. You want to marry me, she stated. Her voice trembled slightly. I intend to marry you, he corrected gently, if you will have me. Isabella looked down at their joined hands. She thought of Harriet Cavendish's vicious face. She thought of Aunt Agatha pricing out her dignity like cheap meat. She thought of the cold, drafty room she slept in, the future of spinsterhood stretching out before her like a barren, gray wasteland. Then she looked at Arthur. She saw the relief hovering just behind his eyes, waiting for her answer. I require my own sitting room, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. And I will not wear pink. A short, ragged breath escaped Arthur's lips. It was the closest thing to a genuine laugh she had heard from him. He lifted her hand, bringing her knuckles to his mouth. He didn't kiss the air above them. He pressed his lips firmly against her skin, the slight scratch of his stubble sending a jolt up her arm. You may wear burlap if it pleases you, he murmured against her skin. God, Isabella, thank you. They did not wait. Arthur procured a special license 2 days later. The speed of it sent shockwaves through Mayfair that rivaled an earthquake. The gossip columns practically ignited. They called her a witch. They called her a blackmailer. They speculated that she was pregnant, though anyone with eyes could see Arthur treated her with a cautious, almost reverent distance that suggested otherwise. On the eve of their wedding, Arthur insisted they attend the opera. It is a mistake, Isabella argued, standing in the foyer of Rothford House. Arthur had sent a dress for her. It was not heavy, unyielding silk. It was a soft, midnight blue velvet that flowed over her hips and shoulders like dark water. It possessed no rigid boning to bruise her ribs. For the first time in her adult life, Isabella breathed easily in evening wear. Yet she felt entirely naked. Arthur stood behind her, looking at their reflection in the gilded mirror. He held a flat velvet box in his hands. "It is not a mistake," he said quietly. "It is drawing a line in the sand. I will not have them whispering that I am hiding you away in shame." He snapped the box open. Nestled in the white satin was the Rothford sapphire. It was massive, surrounded by a cage of heavy, brutal diamonds. It looked ancient and heavy. Arthur lifted it from the box. He stepped closer, his chest brushing the back of her shoulders. Isabella shivered as the cold metal touched her bare collarbone. He fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, his fingers lingering for a second on her skin. The necklace weighed a pound. It pulled her posture straight. It was not an accessory. It was armor. "You look exactly as you should," he murmured in her ear, the scent of cloves and soap wrapping around her. The carriage ride to Covent Garden was silent. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. When they stepped out onto the damp pavement, the flash of carriage lamps illuminated them perfectly. The murmurs started immediately. People stopped on the stairs. Gentlemen lowered their cigars. Ladies paused mid-gossip, their mouths hanging open. Arthur did not hesitate. He offered Isabella his arm. She took it, gripping the fine black wool of his sleeve with white-knuckled desperation. He set a slow, deliberate pace, forcing the crowd to part for them. His limp was a steady, rhythmic tap against the marble floors. As they reached the dress circle, the crowd bottlenecked. Standing directly in their path was Lady Cavendish, draped in emerald silk, flanked by a cohort of her most vicious allies. Isabella's steps faltered. The heavy sapphire suddenly felt like a noose. She wanted to turn around. She wanted to run back to the drafty Huxley parlor and hide under her moth-eaten blankets. Arthur felt her hesitation. His arm locked rigidly, pinning her hand against his side. He didn't stop. He walked them directly up to Lady Cavendish, stopping mere inches from the older woman. "Your Grace," Lady Cavendish said, her voice ringing out loudly in the sudden quiet of the lobby. She looked at Isabella, her eyes dropping to the sapphire, her face contorting with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What an unexpected surprise! We had heard rumors of your impending nuptials, but one always assumes the papers exaggerate the absurd." Someone in the cohort giggled. Isabella felt the blood rush from her face. She stared at the intricate pattern of the carpet, bracing herself for the humiliation. "Lady Cavendish," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, icy resonance. "You seem to be under the delusion that your opinion holds weight." Lady Cavendish blinked, her powdery cheeks flushing an angry mottled red. "I only meant—" "I know exactly what you meant," Arthur interrupted smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You look at my fiancée, and you see an insult to your own ambition. You spent the season treating her as a pariah because she refused to simper and beg for scraps of attention like the rest of you. Your Grace, you go too far." A gentleman beside Lady Cavendish blustered, puffing out his chest. Arthur slowly turned his head to look at the man. The absolute dead-eyed fury in the Duke's gaze made the gentleman shrink back instantly. I am taking my future Duchess to our box, Arthur said, turning back to Lady Cavendish. If I hear so much as a whisper against her name from you or anyone in your circle, I will personally ensure your husband's debts at White's are called in by morning. I will ruin you so thoroughly you will not be able to afford a seat in the gallery, let alone a box. The silence in the lobby was absolute. It was deafening. No one moved. No one breathed. Arthur looked at Isabella. The fury in his eyes vanished, replaced by a quiet, steady reassurance. Shall we, my dear? Isabella looked at the horrified, ashen face of Lady Cavendish. She looked at the crowd, watching them with a newfound, terrifying respect. They were not mocking her anymore. They were afraid. She lifted her chin, the heavy sapphire catching the chandelier light. Yes, Arthur, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Let us. The wedding was devoid of spectacle. There were no choirs, no banks of hothouse flowers, no royal guests. It took place in a small, damp chapel on the edge of the Rothford estate in Kent, smelling of old stone and beeswax candles. Aunt Agatha was there, practically vibrating out of her skin in a new, violently purple silk gown she had purchased on credit the moment the engagement was announced. She kept glancing around the empty pews, clearly devastated that there was no audience to witness her triumph. Isabella wore a simple, unadorned dress of pale ivory wool. It was practical. It was warm. It suited the gray, drizzly morning perfectly. Standing at the altar, Arthur looked better than he had in weeks. The oppressive, suffocating weight of London had been left behind. The dark circles under his eyes were lighter, and his shoulders lacked the defensive, rigid hunch he carried in Mayfair. He wore a simple dark suit, leaning comfortably on a silver-tipped walking stick. When the vicar asked for the vows, Arthur did not recite them with a booming, theatrical voice. He turned to face Isabella fully. He took both of her hands in his, ignoring the vicar entirely. I cannot promise you a life entirely free of the Tun's venom, Arthur said softly, for her ears only. But I promise you will never face it alone. I promise to shield you from the ledgers, the greed, and the noise. I promise you quiet, Isabella. Sorry? Isabella looked at his hands, feeling the familiar warmth and the calluses. This was the prize bull. This was the man they had all fought over, bled for, schemed to trap, and he was offering himself to her, not as a prize, but as a refuge. I do not need you to shield me, Arthur, she replied, her voice steady, rough with emotion. I am used to the mud. I promise to walk in it with you. I promise to never look at you and see a title. I only see you. Arthur swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. He squeezed her hands tightly, a physical anchor. I do, he told the vicar, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. I do, Isabella echoed. The journey to the manor was mercifully short. Aunt Agatha was dispatched back to London with a generous allowance that guaranteed Isabella would never have to see her again unless she chose to. That evening, the great house in Kent was silent. The servants had been dismissed to the lower quarters. Rain lashed gently against the tall library windows, a soothing, rhythmic patter that erased the lingering ghosts of society gossip. Isabella sat in a deep leather armchair by the roaring fire. She had removed the heavy walking shoes, her stockinged feet resting on the warm hearthstone. The ivory wool dress had been discarded for a simple cotton wrapper. She held a glass of dark amber whiskey in her hand. The library door opened. Arthur walked in. He had shed his jacket and cravat, his collar open, revealing the strong column of his throat. He limped slightly, carrying his own glass. He didn't speak. He crossed the room, the firelight catching the faint scar above his eyebrow. He sat in the chair opposite hers, mirroring her posture, stretching his bad leg out toward the heat of the fire. The silence between them was thick, but it was not the suffocating tension of the Danbury ballroom. It was a heavy, warm blanket. It was the absence of expectations. Arthur took a sip of his whiskey. He looked at Isabella, really looked at her, stripped of the armor of the Rothford jewels, free from the rigid cages of society gowns. He looked at the soft lines of her face, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the sheer, unadulterated relief radiating from her posture. Your aunt was very upset by the lack of a wedding breakfast, Arthur noted dryly, staring into the flames. Isabella smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that felt foreign on her face. She will recover once she realizes how much standing credit your name affords her at the modiste. Arthur let out a low chuckle. He reached across the small distance between their chairs. He didn't ask. He gently curled his hand around her ankle, his thumb resting over the pulse point just above her heel. His touch was grounding, warm, and entirely possessive. "Are you happy, Isabella?" he asked, his voice a deep rumble in the quiet room. Isabella took a slow sip of her whiskey, letting the burn settle in her chest. She listened to the rain. She felt the heat of his hand, the comfortable silence of the massive house that was now her sanctuary. She thought of the young, cruel girls in London, spinning in their pastel silks, tearing each other apart for the chance to sit where she was currently sitting. She looked at her husband, this exhausted, cynical, fiercely loyal man who had pulled her from the shadows. "I'm exactly where I want to be," she said. Arthur smiled, the dark, crooked smile that reached his eyes this time. He rubbed his thumb over her skin, settling deeper into his chair. For the first time in years, the Duke of Rothford and the relic of Mayfair finally found peace. If you felt the raw tension and hard-won triumph of Isabella and Arthur's story, show your support by hitting that like button. Their journey proves that true connection isn't about fairy tales or society's approval. It's about finding someone who accepts you, mud and all. Don't keep this romance to yourself. Share this video with friends who crave historical dramas with real depth and imperfect, deeply human characters. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our next captivating, emotionally grounded storytelling experience.